Well, I think it's the second time Professor Cole comes to a international conference in Santiago de Compostela. First one was 1993. Well, Professor Cole is also a very distinguished member of the Florence Mafia. But it's just by case that so many Florentines have been invited to this conference. He studied, if I'm not wrong, in Oxford, and then he went to EUI, where he completed a PhD thesis on the politics of identity in Tirol. And then he came back to England, where he taught history at the University of East Anglia, but now he came back to Central Europe, and he's now a professor of modern history at the University of Salzburg, who's an Austrian by adoption. And, well, among his multifaceted interests, I would say that, I mean, he's a comparative historian of Central Europe, particular of the nationality problem in Austria-Hungary. But today, he's going to talk about remembering World War I within multi-ethnic context, the successor states of the Habsburg monarchy. So, Professor Cole,
yeah, well,
the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, José, for this kind introduction. And also thank you to the Galician Cultural Council for hosting this conference and inviting me as well. I should begin with an apology for not having been able to circulate the paper beforehand. I have a long list of excuses for this, but they're not very interesting, and they're the kinds of excuses you know yourselves, so I won't go through them. Please accept my apologies for that. And also, please note the title of my paper is slightly different to that advertised from South Tyrol to Trieste. It's the last paper, so I will try to be brief and to get through the material as quickly as possible. Historians of 20th century Europe generally agree that the drawing of new boundaries in the aftermath of World War I was a relatively rapid and often haphazard process that left an indelible mark on the political cultures of the new polities. And prima facie, the Wilsonian moment legitimized ethnically demarcated successor states to replace the multinational dynastic empires on the European continent. It remains open to debate how best to describe these states that emerged in Central and Eastern Europe from the territorial settlements in Paris. Some scholars, such as Peter Judson, have suggested recently that the notion of mini-empires is a useful means of categorizing successor states de facto containing more than one ethnic or national minority alongside the core national group, states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and so on. Such a term does indeed reflect the development identified by Leonard Smith, namely that the successor state in multinational Central and East Central Europe came to mean, I quote, an agent structured by an impossibility, a unitary sovereign state that reconciled national and historic boundaries, and here historic boundaries understood as territorial and mostly dynamic. Ended, as you may have noticed. Whatever the validity of such arguments, they should draw our attention from the fact that most successor states pursued nationalizing policies to promote official identity, define the basis for state in narrow regional terms. In other words, the premises of these homogenizing nationalisms were threefold. And these were that, one, there existed an ethno-national essentially owned the polity. Two, the ethno-national core had to dominate unambiguously in the cultural, linguistic, political, and economic spheres of society. And three, the ethno-national core had to be distinguished from minorities resident in the state. Not surprisingly, this meant that newly acquired territories on the border of established, newly formed, recreated states proved to be laboratories for nationalizing policies. Such border areas pose challenges in both symbolic and practical terms. Symbolically, because of the way in which national landscapes, natural landscapes had been nationally codified and mythified in the 19th century, and practically because of the administrative challenges posed by the integration of new territories into the core state. And this was true, obviously, for much of Central and East Central Europe after 1918, but particularly so, I would argue, in regions that had been directly fought over during World War I. In such places, the practical and symbolic challenges crystallized around the problem of dealing with the legacy of war, both in material terms and in terms of national practices. As we know, experiences, narratives, and commemorations of war play a central role in the construction of national histories and senses of collective belonging. So in this paper, I want to explore key aspects of these processes in the context of the Habsburg monarchy. The relationship between nationalizing policies, remembrance practices of World War I, and national minorities is central to an understanding of how the new Europe emerging in the shattered zones of the multinational empires after 1918 actually worked or did not work. This, however, is a topic that has not attracted much research until quite recently, and I draw here on work carried out for a project organized by Mark Cornwall and John Paul Newman at the University of Southampton. And to provide a clear focus, I will concentrate on former areas of the Habsburg monarchy acquired by an already established state, Italy. On the one hand, I'll be looking at German-speaking South Tyrol and Italian-speaking Trentino, and on the other hand, Italy turned Julian March, or Venezia Giulia, Trieste, Friuli, and Istria, which contained Italian speakers, Friulians, Croats, and Slovenes. If my initial concern is to outline how the experience of World War I was interpreted and remembered in these areas, the main argument I wish to make pertains to the impact of nationalizing policies with regard to remembrance of World War I. While the instrumentalization of remembrance of World War I was central to the national radicalization occurring after 1918, official narratives of World War I only enjoyed limited resonance in the regions under examination. So how far the policies of nationalization achieved their goals is thus open to discussion. This, just in brief, is a guide to the area that was fought over. Here you can see the lines of the Southwest Front and the basic gains that were made or sort of the initial gains that were made by Italy at the start of the war. Obviously, the front changes over the course of time, but these are the key areas. And above all, although there is fighting all along the front, the key area, as most of you will know, is in the northeast, the so-called Isonzo front. My paper, as you can see, also is in 3 parts. The introduction is already out the way. I'll be looking at nationalizing policies and then at responses in a last part of the paper. My starting point is that the memorialization of the First World War in these regions needed to be embedded within pre-1914 discourses of national identity, and specifically national movements in both Tyrol and the Austrian littoral attached great significance to the Alpine landscape as the frontier of the respective homelands. The Slovene priest and leading figure in the national movement, poet in the littoral before 1914, Simon Gregorčić, wrote repeatedly about the area of the Upper Soča, Isonzo Valley, in this period. And in doing so, he recognized its national importance and potential vulnerability, suggesting in one of his odes, Sochi, that the river one day would run red with blood before the enemy was defeated. Already before 1914, you have this territory being nationalized, but also the possibility of conflict being envisaged. And needless to say, the resonance of this discourse is greatly heightened by the fierce battles on the mountainsides during the war itself. The words of Gregorčić take on a prophetic quality as 12 bloody battles were waged along the Isonzo front after Italy's entry into the war in 1915. If existing discourses helped shape how the First World War would be remembered, Italy's acquisition of South Tyrol, Trentino, Friuli, Trieste, and Istria reversed the socio-political dynamics of the front in these areas. In the former two areas, in particular, you have a change where the formerly German population, what we could call a losing minority in the winning state, while the Italians of Trentino become ostensibly, at least, a winning majority, obviously in the Italian cultural maintained, but with the difference that this group is part of the majority ethno-national core in Italy. The Italians in this region having previously comprised part of the smallest national grouping in the Habsburg state. And partly Croat minorities in the new provinces, their non-dominant status was maintained, yet in a situation of greater ethno-national majority. Unlike the German minority in South Tyrol, however, their relationship to the outcome of the war was possibly more ambivalent. For South Tyrolians, the war constituted a total defeat accompanied by the loss of sovereignty, to use categories of defeat culture identified by John Horn. While most Slovenes and Croats in the Julian March had fought on the defeated side, the collapse of the Habsburg state and the formation of a new Yugoslav state potentially represented positive points of identification or positive outcomes from the war, even if their hopes of inclusion with the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes were to be disappointed peacemakers. We can explore these issues by concentrating first of all on official attempts at imposing a form of collective remembrance, particularly by looking at monuments as memory material, and then, as I've said, I'll go on to look at responses to these policies. Within South Tyrol, the most prominent example of war commemoration took place in the regional centre Bolzano, and in this respect there was continuity in government policy between liberal and fascist Italy regime nationalising policy to a triumphant new level. The main expression of fascist power was the so-called Victory Monument under in 1928, the initiative of which from Mussolini himself. Mussolini had advocated the acquisition of the Brenner border before 1914, spent time in Trentino in the company of Cesare Battisti, who, as you can see here, had deserted to the Italian side after the outbreak of war, but had then been captured in action and executed in Trento shortly afterwards. Mussolini envisaged the monument, therefore, as a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of Titi's execution by the Austro-Hungarians in 16. The choice of location was highly significant because the monument was erected on the site where the Austrians had since 1916 been planning a war monument to the 2nd Tyrolean Kaiserjäger Regiment, only the foundations of which were completed before the war's end. Here you can see the plans for the monument, what it was intended to look like, and here you can see how far the Austro-Hungarian government got with building this monument by the end of the war. Hence, there could not really have been a more direct way of overturning the official intended Austrian commemoration of the conflict. Nevertheless, the fascist regime's objectives had to be modified when it became clear that members of Battisti's family were opposed to a memorial to him in Bolzano. They considered Trento, where he had lived, worked, and been executed, as the more appropriate location. Hence, the monument became a more general commemoration of the victory, with lower-key depictions of Battisti and his fellow Trentine martyrs, Fabio Filzi and Damiano Chiesa, on the inside of the arch. Marcello Piacentini, the regime's star architect, was responsible not just for designing the victory monument, but also some imposing new barracks and the layout of the new town on the other side of the Talfa River, where Italian migrants, especially administrative officials, came to live. So in other words, this is a victory arch, but it's also, if you like, the gateway to the new Italian town, which is growing up in Bolzano. The monument was unveiled at a lavish ceremony in 1928, attended by the Italian king. The monument became a focal point for fascist displays and a much detested symbol for the South Tyrolean population. While open opposition to the unveiling of the monument was not possible, German-speaking citizens of the town did not cooperate in the preparations, for example, by not letting rooms to participants at the ceremonies, and the authorities were clearly nervous about possible attacks on the monument in the days beforehand. This victory arch constituted a first high point in a wider campaign to implement the Italian nationalist memory of the war in the border regions, as a series of charnel houses were erected across northern Italy during the 1930s. As implied by the Victory Monument, the corollary of fascist remembrance strategy was to erase or diminish commemorations of the war dead by the non-Italian populations, who were referred to as foreigners or allogeni, literally those of a different race or non-natives. We've already come across the term in the context of Soviet Russia. While there were also practical reasons for disbanding the numerous, often not easily accessible military cemeteries that had emerged on along the southwestern front, there was a threefold ideological purpose to the erection of these war monuments. Firstly, they were erected on or near important battle sites that had seen heavy fighting during the war. Such was the case with Castel Dante, as you can see here, a monument outside Rovereto in Trentino, also the case at Monte Grappa in the province of Belluno. However, the major memory sites were associated with the Isonzo front, above all Reggio Puglia, Caporetto, Coberid, and Oslavia, outside the bitterly fought over town of Gorizia. Secondly, these monuments were also intended to mark out the new state borders, symbolically standing watch along the new frontier. Hence, the fascist government also erected ossuaries in South Tyrol, an area that had scarcely been directly affected by the fighting, near the three most important crossing points on the border. Here you can see an example at Burgisio in the west. Another example is at Collesaco, Gossensas to the north. And here it's interesting to see, just to perhaps give a quick quote of the inscription on the monument, which makes explicit this link between war commemoration and the claims to the new borders. The inscription read, "The First Army attacked 2 times, threw back the proud enemy from the Pasubio to the Brenner, assuring to Italy its sacred boundaries." Third purpose of these ossuaries was that the remains of non-Italian soldiers were often included in the charnel houses, and their given names were Italianized on the inscriptions. In effect, therefore, all the fallen were assumed within the dominant culture of remembrance and retrospectively Italianized. Referred to as a charnel house ossario, or more emotively as a shrine, a sacrario, these monuments imprinted a fascist national reading of the war on the landscape. And in this sense, the charnel houses were addressed to 2 audiences. Firstly, they sent an unambiguous message to the non-native populations, to the minorities, that the national frontier was an Italian space. And secondly, they proclaimed the ultimate victory in the war to the native Italian population. And in particular, this celebration of heroic sacrifice sought to affirm a positive narrative of the war, laying to rest the shadow of the defeat at Caporetto in 1917, which had dominated, the idea of a mutilated victory had dominated early discourse on the war in Italy post 1918. This was particularly the case in the Julian March, which occupied an equivalent symbolic space for Italy to that of Alsace-Lorraine for France. A major ossario was constructed at Cobarid, Caporetto, under Italian occupation. But the most spectacular monument was at Re de Puglia, near Monfalcone. And this was not just a statement in a regional context, it also became Italy's national cemetery of World War I. Initially, a cemetery was founded there after the armistice, containing individual graves interspersed with damaged instruments of war. Under Mussolini, the existing cemetery was refashioned into a remembrance park with the new shrine at its center. Built in the monumental neoclassical style typical of fascism, it too was consecrated in September 1938, like the monument in Cobarid, in Caporetto. And it contained 22 large terraces, creating a massive tomb for just over 100,000 dead soldiers. Here you can see how it's constructed. You can see it's placed in front of the front line. This is sort of the front line of the Italian trenches for most of the period. And then there's a sort of a plaque telling visitors essentially that if you go away from this monument without feeling a sense of the heroic sacrifice that was made, then we soldiers died in vain. Here you can see the words presente, presente, presente chiseled into the stone, which served as an eternal roll call of the national sacrifice. As such, this and other monuments became the sites of national pilgrimage and annual ceremonies that reconfirmed the national seizure of territory. In South Tyrol, for example, fascist groups and members of the Legione Trentina made excursions to the new border at the Brenner Pass, and also veterans had annual meetings at these monuments and ossuaries. And from 1927 to 1931, the Italian Touring Club published a series of pamphlets on the battlefields of World War I, which encouraged Italians to visit these prominent sites, especially the shrines along the Isonzo, such as Re di Puglia. Let's come to a final example of nationalization policies, and here we consider the heroicization of two individuals who were promoted as martyrs to the national cause. Cesare Battisti, we've already met. The other key figure is Nazario Sauro, a sailor from Capodistria, Koper, who had left Austria-Hungary like Battisti soon after the war in 1914. Sauro enrolled, though, into the Italian Navy rather than the army. In different actions, as I mentioned with Battisti, both were captured in the summer of 1916, and Sauro too was summarily executed. Almost immediately, both were acclaimed as martyrs, and calls were made for the erection of monuments after the war's end. Once again, therefore, we see this continuity in policy between liberal Italy and fascist Italy. The more spectacular of the two monuments was that to Cesare Battisti on the so-called Dos Trento outside the town of Trento. And the project took several years to develop, partly due to indecision as to the appropriate location, most appropriate location, but also due to tensions arising from the fascists commemorating a socialist politician, albeit a socialist politician who had argued for Italy's intervention into the war. For example, the Italian king and fascist bigwigs laid the foundation stone when the foundation stone for the Victory Arch in Bolzano was laid in 1926. Battisti's son Camillo and other former socialist companions decided instead to mark that event, the 10th anniversary of Battisti's execution, with a private ceremony in Trento. The priority given to the arch in Bolzano and these reservations on the part of Battisti's family about the nature of the glorification meant that it was not until 1935 that this mausoleum was inaugurated with full fascist pomp, with again with the presence of the Italian king. But Battisti's family only participated in the ceremony, opening ceremony, reluctantly. In a coincidental parallel, the monument to Sauro, executed within a few weeks of Battisti, was also only completed in 1935 and inaugurated shortly after the Battisti mausoleum. The original parliamentary decision to erect a monument to him had been taken in 1922, but it's not until 1929 that things really start to get underway, and pressure from the local prefect is necessary to get things moving. This is unveiled, as you can see, on the 9th of June 1935. The monument takes the shape of a stylized submarine, Sauro having served in the Navy, with a victory goddess on the front, and Sauro is depicted then with his mother in the sort of just behind the tower of the submarine, referring to an instant in his captivity when his mother had been called in to identify the traitor. As with the Battisti monument, III attended the unveiling so as to underline the national importance of the monument. However, he only stayed an hour and a half in Capodistria, and when he sought to visit the town's cathedral after the ceremony, he found the doors closed. This was taken to be a deliberate affront by the Bishop of Trieste, Luigi Foga, who had been brought up in the Austrophile tradition of Friulian Catholicism and was accused by the fascists of being a friend of the Slavs. These tensions, then evident in the Battisti Mausoleum project and at the inauguration of the Sauro monument, raised the question as to the effectiveness and reception of nationalizing policies in Italy's new provinces. So in the last part of my paper, I'll briefly survey some examples of responses to aspects of war commemoration from Venezia Giulia, then South Tyrol, and then Trentino in turn. Slovene historian Borut Klabian has examined initial reactions to ceremonies for the unknown soldier in the littoral region in the years around 1921. In 1921, as in Britain and France, Italy unveils in Rome a tomb to the unknown soldier, which is placed in the so-called Vittoriano in Rome, which was the bombastic national monument commemorating the unification of Italy in the 19th century. And for this purpose, an unknown soldier, was chosen from the Isonzo front after a procession from Gorizia to Aquileia, where the coffins of 11 soldiers whose bodies had been exhumed were consecrated. And then the mother of one of these 11 soldiers killed in the fighting on the northeastern front, whose body had never been found or identified, selected one of the 11 coffins to be placed in the monument in Rome. Here we see an example of the procession then, as the coffin made its way then from Aquileia and Gorizia on to Rome. Reactions to the procession of these coffins was monitored by the Italian state, and opinions were voiced in the newspapers. While a few Slovene volunteers who had also deserted from the Habsburg army enthusiastically embraced the procession and ceremony, Klabian suggests that the majority were critical and kept their distance. For example, the main Slovene newspaper in Trieste, Edinost, said of the celebrations in Trieste, "They were not ours." In most districts, noted local officials, Slovenes showed indifference, resignation, or depression, because the ceremonies celebrated purely the Italian triumph and offered no point of identification for those who had been on the wrong side. When the actual reburial ceremony took place in Rome on November the 4th, marking Armistice Day for Italy, local celebrations were organized throughout the new provinces in the northeast as well. But few Slovene villages organized committees to join in these events, and attendance varied. In ethnically mixed areas in particular, it seems that the Slovene population stayed away from celebrations, whereas in areas that were more ethnically homogeneous, of either Slovene or Croat speakers, there was some participation in the event, but Klabian suggests that the main reason for that is the vicinity of the Armistice Day celebrations to the traditional Catholic All Souls ceremony for commemorating the dead. Further research is needed on that issue for Venezia Giulia, but we have more information available for South Tyrol. To begin with, it appears that here the government policy was less invasive at the local level in the immediate period after 1918. Public commemorations for returning soldiers, for example, were unwelcome, but a confidential survey conducted by the fascist authorities in the late 1930s indicates that at least 49 war memorials were erected to the war dead in South Tyrol in the early 1920s. But with the gradual spread of fascist violence in the region from 1921 onwards, South Tyroleans made recourse to the war in response, seeing their struggle for freedom in many respects as a continuation of the war. So there's a question for this population as to if the war has really ended. A notorious incident occurs, as you can see here, in April 1921, when a folkloristic procession in Bolzano is attacked by a fascist squad led by Achilles Tarace, the future party secretary. A teacher is killed, and in the funeral ceremony for this teacher, a local national activist, Edward Roy Nicolussi, praised this most recent martyr for the Tyrolean homeland, equating the death of Innerhofer with the sacrifice of those in the war. Such public protests as took place by Roy Nicolussi become increasingly more difficult, though, as the fascists squads take over, and then as a fascist government is appointed in October 1922. What we see after 1922 is an intensification of nationalization policies, which then extend to the sensitive area also of local cemeteries. The 1923 decree from the prefect of Bolzano sought to prevent war graves and cemeteries in South Tyrol from bearing anything other than religious inscriptions. In other words, praise for heroes, mention of people dying in relation to the fatherland was not allowed. These moves were accompanied by random acts of violence by fascist groups against war memorials throughout the 1920s. The situation became more acute in the autumn of 1927, when the provincial prefect Umberto Ricci sought to extend this 1923 language decree specifically to include gravestones in a supplementary decree on the use of Italian in all public spaces. Here you can see a reaction to this policy by an anonymous individual in South Tyrol, indicating that if Italian has to be used on gravestones, these are the kinds of inscriptions that have to be used. Words such as "death to Italy," "death to the traitors." There's a gravestone for King Victor Emmanuel, and at the bottom are the names of battles that the Austrians had won against the Italians. So this provokes an immediate reaction, and also reports about this policy are sent clandestinely out of South Tyrol to German and Austrian newspapers, claiming that fascist policy was leading to the erasure of inscription on war graves, thus highlighting an emotive issue that attracted also international attention. One British expert on minority problems in interwar Europe, John Stevens, wrote in 1929, for example, like, after 27th of September 1927, a decree of the prefect of Bolzano required even the inscriptions on gravestones to be written in Italian. Few outrages against minorities have done as much as this to arouse public feeling in Europe and America. The growing international outrage led to questions directly being addressed to the municipality of Bolzano from foreign press agencies. The mayor denies the validity of the accusations, but it's clear that the government in Rome became increasingly concerned about the issue. Mussolini was very wary about foreign opinion prior to the mid-1930s, and he was also concerned not to alienate the papacy at a time when some of the early talks about a possible concordat were taking place. So he himself intervened in this matter, telegraphing urgently to Prefect Ricci, explain well to me what the tomb question is, which has aroused such great emotion in Germany and elsewhere. This marks then a kind of turning point in practice. The regime, it seems, has to ease off slightly. Despite repeated pressure from prefects on the ground, the government continued to adopt a cautious approach, allowing exceptions when it came to inscriptions for war memorials or the burial of former soldiers. For example, a marble plaque honoring the dead of 1914 to 18 was placed in the civic cemetery at Merano in 1933. The prefect was obliged to confirm that it was not necessary for names to be transcribed into Italian. German was permissible, so long as it was in Latin script, not in the Gothic style. Let's turn now to a final set of responses, and then I'll come to some very brief conclusions. So turning finally to Trentino, here many members of the Italian national movement active before 1914 played an important role immediately after 1918 in celebrating the region's liberation, as they termed it, and seeking to lay down a heroic interpretation of the war. For example, the Trentine volunteers in the Italian army formed the center of attention at the newly founded Museo Storico della Guerra, the Italian Historical War Museum in Rovereto, which gave pride of place to Battisti and his fellow martyrs, Fabio Fuzzi and Damiano Chiesa, who featured on this plaque to the volunteers in Rovereto. Yet it remains open to question how far this reflected the sentiments and actions of the wider population. In practice, many communities after 1918 initially refrained from joining in the heroicization promoted by liberal Italy, erecting simple monuments with neutral inscriptions. For example, at Grauno, the memorial was dedicated simply to its fallen, or at Brione, a monument was erected to its sons, fallen in the war 1914 to 1918. Such villages had the backing of the Popular Party prior to 1925 and the tacit support of the Catholic Church thereafter. The Church sought to place a different emphasis on remembrance, at least until 1925, 1927, when it too doesn't want to alienate the fascist regime because it too is anxious for a concordat. But certainly up until 1925, the Church stressed the need for peace and reconciliation within an Italian patriotic framework. One symbol of that was an enormous peace bell, the bell for the fallen, Campana dei Caduti, set in the museum at Rovereto in 1925. However, a clear change is visible as the fascist dictatorship became established after 1925. Aldo Miorelli has indicated that of 280 monuments subjected to historical analysis, this has been carefully mapped out, and erected in Trentino between 1919 and 1940, 240 still contain the original inscriptions. Only 50 of these were dedicated to the fallen, the Caduti, thereby carrying an implicit acknowledgement of their having fallen in Austria-Hungary's name, but nearly all of these monuments of this style were erected prior to 1923. After the mid-1920s, a redemptive rhetoric takes hold, as at Lavis, this example here, meaning that villagers had to pass over in silence the fact that their men had fought on the wrong side in the conflict. In this sense, a definite nationalization of regional remembrance of war characterized public representations in formal terms. Yet it is doubtful that this hegemonic discourse reflected the sentiments of the wider population. Work by Quinto Antonelli on individual memories of the war in Trentino, whether on the battlefield or in internment camps, indicates that popular recollections were frequently at variance with the official paradigm of national redemption. Moreover, from a later perspective, Jaro Statsul's anthropological study of the village of Caoria in the Vanoi Valley during the 1990s is suggestive of dissonance between official and popular memories of the First World War. Local historical memory of the arrival of the Italians after 1918 was to see them as foreigners, with many villagers having positive views of Austria for various reasons, the schooling system often being named as one of them. As Statsul comments, it is no accident that several households in the valley keep a collection of photographs of ancestors wearing the Austro-Hungarian uniform during the Great War, while villagers also kept their distance from the nationalized monumental landscape of war cemeteries and museums glorifying the liberation. To conclude then, very briefly, the Italian state's efforts at instrumentalizing commemorations of World War I were effective in terms of public display, in terms of marking out the new borders, and in determining a hegemonic discourse about the war. Significantly, however, there was evident dissonance between official public commemorative acts and popular memories reflecting social and ethnic differences. As in Czechoslovakia, where public commemoration centered on the Czechoslovak legions and, for example, events like the Battle of Sporov in 1917, national minorities were, for the most part, excluded from the official discourse about the war. Yet while official narratives achieved differing degrees of resonance, in none of the regions discussed did there emerge meaningful counter-memories in the public sphere, ones with sufficient institutional, political, or social power to displace the official discourses. Thank you very much.